And we are on air. We are live, or as live as it gets in this realm. And I am having a dialogue with a good friend, Devan, who is out in Utah, where the Ute Indians live. And he is another student and teacher of A Course in Miracles. So you already know what direction this whole thing is heading.
It's going to the end of the world. That's where it's going.
Yes, the disappearance of the universe, as Gary proclaimed it. And you can already start to see that, it's like being in a dark room, and you just start to open the door, and you have that crack of light around the extremis of the door. And I feel like that's the era that we live in, the beginnings of illumination. The doors are slowly starting to open, and we can see the light beginning to penetrate into our realm of the dark.
And usually we're looking at those shadows that, that light is shining on my hands, and you're like, oh, what is that? There's something happening. A lot of us remain to be obsessed with the shadows of that light is casting, instead of actually realizing, right? That light is what the purpose is. I was just talking about shadows with someone yesterday. That, the light casts out all the darkness, but then there's the resistance of physical objects, resistance as in my mind. And as I have those resistances, and I see the representation of shadows as well, resistance to that light. So all these things happening all at once. I don't know what that necessarily had to do with what you're saying, but yeah, open that door. Woo!
Yes, and the shadows will resolve themselves as soon as the light fully embraces us, or we embrace it.
Agreed.
So, and it is an interesting period in time, because we're seeing our sanity really come into focus over a broad spectrum of parts of society. This year politically, it's really, it's really been a lunatic asylum, as far as for those of us who grew up in the 50s and 60s and saw the world through a much more filtered, I guess, set of circumstances. And now it seems to be, it's all out in front of us. And this is a wonderful thing, because it's causing us to really stop and recognize that God never could possibly, in his deepest or its deepest state of madness, create something that would parallel this particular series of events we're seeing going on all over the planet, with politics and religion and money and all of those things that we get addicted to.
Yeah, I'm as far as the actual conditions, as what I've heard, it seems like it's phenomenal how much can be done all of a sudden. I see old laws dropping away, and new laws coming into play, and I'm surprised that it can happen so quickly all of a sudden this year. It seemed like it would take a while for things to happen, get through the House and everything, but now all of a sudden this, what's his name? I forget his name. Trump. All of a sudden he can pass all these certain laws and get rid of old fundings and everything, and it's interesting. It's interesting.
Well, it really is putting a lot of emphasis on the idea of, are you willing to take responsibility for the universe that you exist in? Yeah. And so a lot of these ideas about blaming exterior forces. So it's because of
they did it.
Yeah, the nasty guys in the sky polluting and raining down madness and death on us, and the Ebola or bird flu viruses. These are all ways.
Conspiracies.
This is a way of avoiding the reality that you created, whatever it is that's crippling you, and now you're trying to blame it on an exterior force, and there is no exterior force. The only power that exists is God. That's it. End of story.
It's true. I am.
Exactly.
I am trying to blame it on. I keep seeing other people trying to blame it on other people, and yes, I am definitely thinking about that.
It's, you know, it really, what it boils down to is self-acceptance. If you accept yourself as being literally omnipotent in your own world, you have the power to move your own mountains that you have created. And if you're willing to look at that and say, well, what the hell am I doing here, walking around like a crippled person and living life to its smallest instead of its greatest, then you know.
So what are you doing it?
Well, you're living in fear. You're living out the fears that caused you to run and hide.
If you're omnipotent and you have all power to do anything you want, then you seem to be doing this like because you want to. So there's got to be like a purpose to it that omnipotent one keeps choosing it for, because it can get out at any time. It's omnipotent, right?
Right, but I think it's also very diluted, and you know, it loves to listen to its own stories, and so, you know, the stories that involve isolation, separation, and detachment from others. I mean, we definitely want to live a life that is detached, but we don't want to detach ourselves from the rest of the Christ that surrounds us.
Like, but only I want to do that. Only me, nobody else.
Yeah, well, I think if you go on YouTube or YouTube, either one, you will you'll be confronted with a plethora of people who have a similar bent about them.
So where are you living? You live in Chicago? Is that what it is?
Yeah, I'm in one of the southern suburbs down in Burbank near Oak Lawn, and it's a very multicultural area, which is what I like. You know, we have a strong presence of Irish and Italian and Arabic peoples and Mexican peoples and African American peoples, so Eastern Europeans, and all kinds of delis and all kinds of ethnic events going on. So it really is rich in diversity. And diversity.
So I live in this, you know, I always want to say fundamental Mormon, but it's not, because that's a whole nother religion almost. The mainstream Mormon church, right? And so it's not quite as diverse as, you know, I moved here when I was about 10 years old. Well, my family and I remember seeing my first, you know, African American person, and like I remember, and so you can get an idea that how unusual it is. It's like Utah, I feel, is stuck in the rut as much as, or as more than, well, I can't say that. Then I start thinking of other places, and I really have no idea. But it's interesting that you know, we're all stressing over here, not me, but you know, there's a lot of stress going on about how many people coming over from the border and all that stuff. So it doesn't sound as diverse as what I'm saying as your location, which is nice. And I think we're all cave dwellers around here, at least myself. I spend a lot of time in here.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the things that one of the astronauts commented, that once he got into space and was able to look at the planet, it became very visceral for him. The idea, the notion that there are no lines on the planet, that is strictly something that truly is evidence of A Course in Miracles, because all of our boundaries, all of our geographic locations, all of our national and ethnic separations are all imaginary lines. I mean, there's no, or there are very few trenches that literally, you know, show up like the Grand Canyon that separate the Polish people from the German people, or the Nigerian people from, their neighbors. And so, again, this goes back to A Course in Miracles in a brilliant way, because A Course teaches us that God is infinite. So if we look at the expressions of what God's children can do, all their dances, all their magic, all of their expressions of artistry and cuisine and music and theology and mysticism, it just goes on and on and on. It becomes deeper and deeper and deeper. And yet it all comes out of the oneness. And when you look at the earth from space, it is one globe. So why are we allowing ourselves to be conflicted and to attack each other when all we're doing is just manifesting this really astonishing diversity, this astonishing level of creativity that we should be living in glory as we're engaged in doing this?
Yeah. Well, as they say, a common enemy brings people together.
Yes. The scary thing, though, is that when you discover the common enemy is yourself. That's
yeah, that's fun. I'm more thinking, another planet. It would bring the whole planet together, and then eventually we need to realize the whole universe is together as well. One universe.
Well, and then there are the multi-universes out there, so it just goes on and on and on. And again, this gives us a sense of what God is all about. Is you can't put a box around God, and just you can't put a box around universes, because they just keep going on and on and on. And that's because we are recognizing the infant, or the infinity that exists in the mind.
Yeah, and you're touching on subjects that I talk about often. Through my death experience, as I call it, I was kind of revealed this knowledge of the 10 dimensions of reality. And I still, in a lot of my conversations, kind of put it into perspective that each dimension is kind of a dream among dreams and within itself, and that they're all kind of paradoxical to another. And so you get into that whole multiverse idea, and that's the fifth, sixth, and seventh dimensions, and it's just endless variations and so many different possibilities. So as far as A Course in Miracles and making sense out of that into these 10 dimensions, is the most idea of what A Course in Miracles is that fourth dimensional perspective of a personality, and having to do with time, and that it thinks it's a third dimensional body that has a life and come from birth to death, and has a past and supposedly a future. And we're awakening that from the same consciousness type perspective of the fourth dimension into the split other side of the first dimension, which is considered the Son of God, the original, or the only begotten Son, as it's referred to. And that, brings back the authority in which you're talking about, that omnipotent one, the creator of all the universes upon universes. And it's not held back by any simple or little idea unless it wants to. And so it kind of comes up with that, what is the purpose that Son sees? There is a purpose to this reality that's unfolding, because, we got eternity to play with here. We got endless time, endless variations, endless choices. Oh, is it? What's the question? Is it really a big deal? We make it such a big deal, like about race and everything, because we're so enveloped. I was looking around the store the other day, and I'm like, wow, oh man, I forget that people don't know reality. I talk to even my son and everything, thinking he knows everything about the world, and I forget that he hasn't even learned his ABCs, and hasn't learned to go in the potty, wash his hands. Wow, it's so easy to see yourself and forget that even these alternate perspectives are quite literally another universe of experience.
Yes, and one of the things that can be terrifying for those of us who imagine ourselves to be all grown up is to look in the face of the newborn child, which you're doing a lot of right now, and seeing that innocence, and then having that random thought, what if I was as innocent, as unprotected, as vulnerable as this child? And that our ego definitely gets whipped into a frenzy with those possibilities. It's like, oh my God, some dog is going to come down the alley and snatch me out of the crib and carry me away and feed me to his puppies or her puppies. And so again, we're so addicted to the idea that our body is who we are, that we entertain all these fears and needless, pointless contemplations about how we can be hurt, how we can be damaged, how we can be compromised as we make a step into a different realm of thinking. So there's also a fear factor when we start to push beyond our accepted boundaries. It pushes back immediately, and we have to be able to be willing to look at that.
Yeah, you have to. I mean, if you want to see in a perspective of reality as far as the spiritual universe, it is definitely what would be considered to that idea, that perspective of the physical universe, completely insane, just completely crazy. And it's terrifying, absolutely terrifying. And when I am attempting to induce myself into an out-of-body experience or something as simple as that, just on that brink of experience, just that, it's like a geyser of fear. Just it's like, whoa, what do you think you're doing? This is not in the paradigm in which exists here. And you're like, no. And you want to, you panic inside, and you realize that the basis of this physical reality is essentially fear. And just keeping that idea, death is real, so that you can experience physicality in bodies.
Mm-hmm.
This fun experience that doesn't happen any other time in infinity. It's just right here, right now.
Right, and it's kind of interesting, you were talking about how the locals there are concerned about people slithering across the border, and yet one of the most incendiary groups within the Mormon religion were those who were polygamists, who went and settled just right across the border. They invaded Mexico and set up their communities. People who remember Mr. Romney from past presidential election processes, he was born in that environment. And so
he was born over there, of the fundamental church. Because
right.
I know he's the mainstream church. I didn't know that, but I'm not entirely political, so I don't keep up to date.
Yeah, he distanced himself from his ancestry simply because he knew that would get him in trouble politically. But he comes from a group of polygamists, and it's interesting to see how the early Mormons practiced enthusiastically polygamy, and that was how they were able to entrench themselves there around Salt Lake City, was because they were able to pump out kids. You need kids.
It is still a belief in all of Mormonism, every single Mormonism, to practice polygamy. It's mostly about spiritual life, and that there's far more feminine spirits than there are masculine. It's just the only reason the mainstream Mormon church does not practice it, which there are some people that secretly do, but it is all because of the law of the land, and that's something that they say. I was raised as in the mainstream Mormon church myself, and it's simply about obeying the laws of the land become more important, because they could literally take you from your family and all these things, which in itself is outrageous. Like I do not think any paperwork or laws should restrict anyone in any way of marriage or whatever. Of course, underage marriage is outrageous, and that's a totally different story of getting into underage children and all that stuff. So that's where I stand as far as that. I think it should be perfectly fine if a group of people want to get married all together, then they should be allowed to do that. As long as they're not being forced to do anything, they should be allowed to. It doesn't make any sense to me that anybody should say, like, my wife and I are not legally married right now. We plan to get legally married in July. We were an advent of marriage back last year, and but we're legally getting married this year, and we're kind of splitting it up. But it's kind of fun. That, to me, a paper means it's so obvious that you give all the meaning to it that it has, and it's really just all it is a statement to other people. Hey, this is actually true. I have this paper that says we're actually married. But in no point in my mind has it changed, or will it change because a paper is signed?
Yeah, and that's a part of culture again. If you go back, if you're really into Jesus and you have this adoration for that personality that Jesus was presenting to the world, number one, you have to realize that when Mary was pregnant, she was probably between 12 and 13 years old. So she probably gave birth to Jesus when she was a 13-year-old girl. And then all of the apostles, except, I believe, Simon Peter, who was supposed to be the eldest of the apostles, I think he may have approached the age of 20. But like John the Beloved, the youngest of the apostles, was probably 13 years old. He had just attained manhood, because that was the prevailing culture of that era. So when you see these paintings of Jesus and he's surrounded by these guys with white beards and doing all this yada yada yada, it's like no. The truth is that your white American sensibilities are going to hit a brick wall when you really confront the fact that it wasn't a bunch of adults. It was Jesus, the 33-year-old guy, who was surrounded by a bunch of teenage boys who created a movement that transformed the world. So, from that point, from that very eruptive point, you've got to sort out in your own mind whether or not you're willing to buy into all of society's prevailing beliefs. Because that's what we're doing with the Course in Miracles. We are disassembling all of our restrictions, inhibitions, fears, condemnations, attacks on each other. The person who gets married to 3 different women in 3 different places around the country and maintains a polygamous lifestyle, if he is trapped and caught, then all of society stands up and demands that he be jailed and punished. And that's the whole thing that the whole Course in Miracles goes against, is the idea of punishment. Because this life, this dream, is not real, and we have to be willing to step aside and say, why would I punish somebody for having a fantasy that ultimately all the participants were willing to participate in that family, in that fantasy, in that particular fashion?
Beautiful.
So, that gets into deep water. I mean, leaving a trail of that kind of dialogue, I'm sure there are going to be people who have thoughts that they would like to share with me. They're probably not real complimentary, but that's all right.
Yeah, it's funny. I look at people and I suddenly come back into realizing, oh, look, they think that this is about bodies. Oh, they think that they're conversing with other people. I think of those 10 Commandments, so prominent in many people's belief systems, and I was asked one time if I believed in them, and I said very confidently that if you were and knew of the spiritual universe, it would be impossible to do any of these things.
Right.
and,
And
and
it becomes,
go ahead.
it just becomes the ultimate non sequitur. Is what the hell? You're having a hallucination here. You obviously dropped the brown acid because you're having a bad trip, and get over it.
Yeah, and just the thought of it, of what's the term? I can't even think of any of the commandments. That's funny. Well, I know you can't kill anybody because you can't die, right? You can't steal anything because no one really owns anything, and it's not physical anyway. And you can't covet your neighbor's wife because energetically you're all connected and pretty much in this blob energetic orgy anyway. So you're all, and I see this whole dance thing going on with energy and just this flow of the universe. And it's hilarious to me to just come snapping back to the perspective of bodies. And I'm like, oh yeah, I'm sorry, you actually are talking to me as if I'm separate from you. I didn't realize that, and so it changes the whole subject. I see why you're stressing about things. You think death is inevitable, and so it changes the whole subject. It's like, oh, I thought we were connected and joined in this whole vastness of beauty and love, and then whoa, okay, oh, fear, death, yes, sorry about that.
Yeah, I've had my rounds with that one too. 4 years ago in June, I was doing my thing, living up in Wisconsin, and I had that experience of it was about 7:38 in the evening, and I got up and left my work desk area and was walking into the bedroom, and this voice said, and it was like megaphones in both ears, said, "Call 911." And I thought, oh, well, that's stupid. So then I noticed a little bit of hesitation in my breath. So I thought, and I did in fact call 911. By the time the ambulance got to my house, I was really aware of the fact that I was losing the capacity to breathe. And so they rushed me to the hospital. And this is an interesting point, because my conscious memory, and remember there's this ego mind, I stopped recording a memory halfway to the hospital. Then I was told after the fact that when I arrived at the hospital, I had lucid dialogue with the doctors and the nurses. And it wasn't, just one or two words. I had in-depth conversations, giving them vital information. And then the next thing I know, I wake up 6.5 days later, and I had been on life support. I'd been on a breathing machine. And the doctors had said, well, just unplug him because he's gone. There's been no brain activity in 6.5 days, and so nothing can happen there. And so they unplugged me, and I popped back up like the little Energizer buddy. And things got, even more interesting, because I had had my own experience with that passage where the ego mind is entrenched in this processing everything that we experience and creating memory. But there was no memory of that 6.5 day span, or very limited memory. So by dying, when you die, the ego part of you is going to be lost in the winds of time. It's irrelevant. It was never real. So why would you want to try to preserve it? And that's when it gets really interesting, because when you have that near-death experience, you do come back with a whole different angle on what life is, what constitutes life on every level of experience.
Yeah. So mine, my death experience wasn't as obvious as yours. And I had nobody telling me I was dead or anything. And it was in 2012, December 2012, December 10th to be exact, 2012. And I was on my journey for 4 years already, and I was attempting to free myself from the world and heal the world and the disappearance of the universe and forgive everything as much as possible. And so I mean, as far as the physical story, I was meditating and I started having a seizure, and I was a little cold, and I was told in a holotropic breathing about a week ago to embrace the cold, and my life started flashing before my eyes. And in that instant, I remembered that the cold that I hate so much, I hate the cold, mostly because of the being pulled by cesarean out of my mother. It was the first sensation I had of the world, being extremely cold. And I mean, so I have this whole story about, my experience of death, which is, and we can always get into some other time. And it was definitely eye-opening, extremely life-changing. Let's say I knew I was done with my journey at that point as being a vision quest. I didn't really realize it was a vision quest until then.
Very interesting, yeah. And I think that whole concept of a vision quest is something that we all end up engaging in, whether we're able to identify it or not. But there are always those pivotal experiences that we have in life where we hit that point where all of our beliefs that are giving us a sense of security come under review. And that really is what a vision quest is. It's allowing your preconceived belief of the universe and what it constitutes to be expanded, not to be destroyed or not to be broken apart, but simply to be expanded. Oh, you are here, this tiny little ball of clay on the face of a planet in an obscure part of the universe. And all of a sudden, there was a doubling or tripling of awareness, which is a tiny expansion, really, in relationship to the multiverses that surround us. But that little tiny shift, all of a sudden, gives you such a new level of comprehension of the actual point of life. And the point of life is to live it, to experience it, to be it. To reclaim your beingness, no matter where you are. You can be sitting on the top of a mountain ledge in the Himalayas, or you can be in the middle of the frickin' desert down in Sonora, Mexico, doing the Apache peyote dance. But no matter where it is, if you have that slight alteration of perception where you walk away from it feeling bigger, feeling like something happened here, I may not be able to define it, but I suddenly have fewer limitations. I'm less of a body and more of a being. Then that's the vision quest. That's what you've experienced, and everybody has it to one degree or another, randomly throughout their lives.
Yeah. So were you participating with Course in Miracles International at all up in Wisconsin?
Not really, no. I was living near Lake Geneva, and the two Course in Miracles groups, one was up in Baraboo, up by Wisconsin Dells, and the other was much further north, up in Kiel, up toward Algoma, which is up, near Door County. And I actually, just in the last 3 years, have started to, I guess you could say, participate more, because I really felt like I was still in some sort of a gestation prior to about 3 years ago. And now, for some reason, it's like I'm supposed to be expanding that realm of communication.
So when did you get into A Course in Miracles? Was it about 3 years ago? Or?
No, I got into the course in 1996.
Okay.
And it was through a good friend, well, through a very visionary fellow who was one of the early course people, Alan Cohen. He had written a book called I Had It All the Time. And that is a very good book as an introduction to a lot of Course in Miracles thinking.
Yeah, I have that book.
Yeah,
I have it all the time.
Yeah, and it's a great book. I mean, you know, and after I read that book, he mentioned A Course in Miracles, and I went out and bought a copy of the Course, and that was actually a very pivotal period in my life, because I actually manifested a huge number of physical issues. And I think that the Course, when you first have contact with it, it will bring things up that you need to just stop and say, okay, I've got to quit buying into this shit. I've got to address this. And so that's what it did for me. So, you know, I spent, I spent about 15 years going through multiple phases of literally ingesting the Course, I guess you could say. I became an eater of the Course. I was eating the Course 3 times a day as my primary source of nutrition.
And vitamin.
Yeah, and but it was taking me layer after layer after layer into the depths of my own madness. You know, and that's why I can laugh at other people's madness now, because to whatever degree of madness that we're experiencing, that's our anchor in this world.
Good word to put, anchor. Good word. Good word.
And then it becomes a choice. You know, do you want to anchor yourself in your particular form of madness, or are you getting ready to let go of that, cut yourself free?
Yeah, is it time to become more? You know, do we want to experience more? Yeah, and you're given that choice. Yeah, and to get into another little bit about my death experience. I mean, there's so much. It just there was so much in the experience of it that it's hard to leave out stuff while I'm breaking it up in my story. But there was a time I was kind of in front of a council without form. And it was kind of the decision without words was given me. I can ascend the world if I want to. I would just have to remember why I came here in the first place. So everything that was this potential future at the time was revealed to me, as much as my life flashed before my eyes. And I saw having a family and saw a multitude of things. And the decision was that if I wanted to go back and continue this life, I would just have to accept a resentment or a grievance. And I did that. I resented the fact that I wouldn't be a father and experience having children. And I also resented the person I was with was going to give a false message of what happened to me and make it seem suicidal and all this stuff. So instantaneously, the reason I'm bringing this up is instantaneously everything stopped, and I returned to the state of consciousness of the physical world and being completely coherent and right back into the world. But I recognized through that the only way to see the physical world is to quite literally have some sort of fear, some sort of grievance, some sort of idea that you're separate from something. Even if it's one thing, it doesn't matter. It's the whole package. Like, you can't see 2 worlds at once. And so that whole package just comes with one idea. So in that moment, through my death experience, I'm completely confident to say I had officially no grievances, no more things to forgive. No. And so I was literally, the whole universe was disappearing. Yeah. No, give me another grievance. Yeah. He's yawning. I'm boring him. Yeah. No.
No, I'm definitely enjoying what you're sharing here, because again, it validates so much of what other people have shared. on parallel paths. You know, Anita Mujari, who wrote Dying to Be Me, if you read that book, that woman has an astonishing story of, having to go through that process of releasing and finally arriving in a place where she was free of all of her attachments, and then was able to come back and live in a much more beneficial way, because it's not just the attachment to negative things. I mean, we often have attachments to helping our brothers.
Yeah.
And if you have that attachment, then you're going to come back in here, whether you're taking physical form or not, and you're going to be acting as an intercessory being on the behalf of the Christ, on behalf of everyone.
Yeah. It was a deliberate decision to come back, was mostly to have and experience my family still. And it does come down to the fact that, you have eternity to play with. I mean, yeah, you're saving time, but, time is just a tiny speck in endless eternity. And so it's not really like a huge deal that you're doing it. You might as well do it with heart. You might as well do it with love. You might as well, bring heaven here. In that same right. It's, as far as I see, A Course in Miracles is the attempts to get you to start recognizing not only just who you are as that omnipotent self, but that quite literally the life you live is your deliberate decision, and you're doing it to yourself. You're wanting to do this, and if you want it to be different, make it different. You go ahead and do it differently. And if that means out of body, if that means, alternate universal realities, if that means, this life particularly, if that means suffering, it doesn't matter. Enjoy it, and that's really that recognizing, that you do it to yourself. It's easy to enjoy when you recognize that. Even suffering, I find myself, if I'm in stress or something, I make light heart and laugh at myself that it's fun, it's enjoyable. I'm doing this on purpose. Why not enjoy it? I can enjoy it.
It's kind of a way of rebuking your ego in that sense, in that the ego is always having a meltdown over, my poor back, my arthritis, my bad eye, whatever it is. The ego loves to keep it inflamed. And if you can look at it and laugh at it and bounce back with it and say, oh my goodness, this is a travesty, this is hideous, but I chose this. So, apparently the meaning of all of this is for me to choose more wisely in the future. And number two, not to be that attached to the ego's demands that I be miserable and suffer my way through it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it was helpful at one point in my life, this ego thing. I remember developing it as a safety mechanism that I, didn't exactly know what was going on around me. And so as I saw myself as this thing that was stuck to this thing, this body thing, it was helpful to like process information and keep myself from feeling this sensation of pain that came through the body and everything. So it helped me avoid those things often. But yeah, it was just a temporary need while I thought that was true, and now as coming out of, thinking that the truth of the body is the only reality, and the physicality and the properties of physicality actually are true, its service is no longer necessary. It's like, no, I'm conscious aware enough in this physical world and out of it enough to say, your services are no longer required. And if you want to be a part of this existence still, you have to think differently. You have to help me differently, And it's kind of that training of the mind to, if I want to have this experience still, let's do it in a joyful fashion. And and kind of reflect that love instead of, I don't want to do it out of this fear and pain thing.
No, you want to do it out of a desire to reclaim all the different parts of yourself.
Yeah.
So that everybody that you encounter, you acknowledge as being yourself in another variation, you know. And so as we're collecting our multiple selves together, the one binding component, your grout that you need to get the tiles to stick together is love. That's the binder. That's the binding element. And that actually is not a bad purpose. That's not a bad theme to have to continue to exist, is to become, you know, a part of that process of reclaiming all of the separate parts of self and binding them together with love.
Yeah. And what is that to me? You know, what is love to me? And, you know, even though it has no real definition, and that's somewhat of a stepping stone for most people, that, you know, we have this idea that I remember trying to define love, trying to make sense out of it, you know, thinking that it has to do with between people and between bodies. And so it made it, you know, hard to comprehend. It was like trying to take something of reality and trying to squish it down to these tiny little definitions. And so it does, even as my mind was expanding into comprehending vastness of love, like just recognizing your true self and who we really are as that one self, and just the actual evidence of that being love itself. You know, it's definitely more of an experience still. It remains to be an experience more than any definition. And so as far as, you know, my person and how it's expressed, you know, some people say, oh, I'm not a hugger, and I'm not a kisser, and, you know, those don't necessarily apply. You know, bodily actions don't necessarily apply to my definition of love, that it's not really between two bodies, but it doesn't exclude that. You know, it's completely all encompassing, and it's just, you know, I can understand the foundation of love and everything based off of love, or I can assume that one of those branches that is based off of love, as love, instead, you know, like making babies and making love, and that's based off of, you know, like symbols of symbols of symbols of symbols to come to that point. But if I understand that foundation, that first dimension, and that relationship between the God creator aspect of that sun, the experiencer aspect of the same one whole totality of love, then everything, and it just expands. Does that expansion of your awareness into all things are love. It is, you know, there's not even that call for love anymore. It's just everything's an expression of love and that relationship with God. It's pretty miraculous.
It is, and that's where we begin to enter that abstract realm. When, you know, when we're in this world, we have these separate thoughts, and the separate thoughts about God. God is love, God is life, God is peace, God is joy. But as we get beyond this fractionated world that's all broken apart, we come to a new awareness that, you know, all of those concepts become fluidly immersed in each other. And there is this abstract state of being that is referred to as God, but it certainly is not definable in this realm. We have to just say God is and then walk away from the microphone.
Yeah, and you can pretty much define it maybe up to 99%, but then, you know, you can't actually do it justice. And that's kind of how I feel like all these images of these multidimensional experiences that we're going through, and this, even this physical image as we see ourselves, it's like the question we asked was, you know, what am I? What is God? What is the truth of what's happening? And just, being that omnipotent creator that quite literally thinks into existence is being represented. Here's the answer to your question. And we're seeing this daily life of physicality is, the only way to ask what is God is to be separate from God, and experience separation from God and attempt to find it, and only to realize that you can't be, and that what you search for is right there within you.
Yeah, it's just this compounded and compounded and compounded.
Yeah.
So that, Jesus said something about shaking it down. And that's really what it is shaking the whole thing down to the absolute bottom of truth. And the truth is just the truth. You don't have to go anywhere else but there.
So you have a website and a way that people can contact you in some way?
Yeah, I'm at Onefeather Journal. It's all one word, ONEFEATHERJOURNAL.com. That's my website. Awesome. And I have a lot of Native American stuff there. And some of my Course in Miracles stuff. And then just other stuff. So there's lots of stuff to look at.
The YouTube videos and stuff, it connects on there. And
then my services.
That I'm recording this episode as well, and through my podcasting, that's mostly what I do with openandclear.com. So for you, OPENANDCLEAR.com, and as well as my services and things. And so I like that we can mingle, and I really enjoy this conversation, tossing off of each other, and I feel like we're getting somewhere, and I'm sure we're inspiring some people out there as well, and just opening minds. The more minds open, the more minds open. Minds, is that plural and singular at the same time?
Yes. The only one here who benefits from all of this is me, and me and thee are one. So
it's me and me and thee are one.
Yes. And it's just like the old "Why did the chicken cross the road?" And the chicken on the other side is saying, "I didn't cross the road."
It's like, oh, there's a road? Might as well cross it again.
There you go.
Oh, there's a road? It reminds me of Finding Dory. It doesn't remember what's going on.
Well, it was a great conversation, Devan, and we'll have to do this again. If people want us to do this little chitter-chatter thing, they should, give us a little high five and let us know that they're enjoying it.
Yeah, please let us know that you want to hear more. And as far as Wednesdays is pretty good for me. So, if you want to stay in touch and we talk about going on it further, I'm totally open. I feel like we're in a pretty good flow here, and it's enjoyable. And I get to know you and everything. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you. It was great having time with you, and thanks for reaching out.
Yeah. Have a beautiful day.
You too. I'll talk to you soon.
Bye.